Thanks very much, Ambassador. That's a huge question. Poets are known for being very brief.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I'm not a novelist, so I'll try to answer all of that this evening, and also to hear from two fellow poets whom I really look up to on this question as well. I think, and I speak for so many poets in the room, that poetry means something different to everyone who writes and hears it, right? It is that most personal of writing forms. It is the song of the heart, as it were. And so much of song, exclamation, text, scripture that we read, etc., all come down to different forms of poetry. So poetry, I think, is something that's very central to the human experience, but at the same time, something that's able to take in lots of different kinds of human experience. And that's very important for what we are talking about this evening, because poetry is something that lives in different cultures. It's something that is, in so many cultures, has been passed through oral tradition from one generation to the next. And here in Singapore, it's something that's alive. It's here in this room. All of the different people who are here who practice poetry in different ways as publishers, writers, reporters, etc. You all are part of a living poetry ecosystem. So in its very nature, I think poetry brings people together. But to touch on the question about past and future, I think that's something that I deal with quite a lot in my work. I had good fortune or misfortune, as some may see it, to be a history student at university. This meant that I spent a lot of time in the library, not with many other people, but just on my own, and reading about stories and human encounters in the past. What struck me most from many of these historical sources were what they captured of the first encounters between very different peoples and cultures. Here in this part of the world, we have texts, Malay texts, for instance, that recall the first meeting between Portuguese sailors and the peoples of Malacca. This was before, of course, Malacca became a Portuguese possession. We have texts that recall many of these cultural first encounters. And what we often find in that moment of first encounter, recorded through poetry to us today, is that those were moments of joy and of discovery and of excitement, because for once, someone who is so different is making a human connection with you. So many of these instances through history, I remember them in my work, and I think the work that all of us do in making poetry and bringing poetry to others recreates some of that joy of first encounter here in Singapore, in this room and so. But yeah, Alvin and...
No, I mean, just seconding what Theo has said, is something about the encounter in poetry is very powerful. And usually if I use the word here, when we write a poem, we write for that personable, deeply felt song of the heart, as you say, Theo, but in a way that speaks powerfully to these larger categories as well. And it has this sheer possibility to go across borders, because a poem, when you write it, it's a sort of invention on the page. It's a saying or something that may not have been thought of as possible before, but in its articulation makes possible. I think there's something very brave and hopeful in that as well. It's not something that can be contained by a particular space or time, as you pointed out. And in relation to the circulation of text, I mean, we'll hear you read later. It's wonderful to be here to celebrate your poetry. And in that space of a poem, whether on the page or in person or orally, something very powerful and personal and intimate is being enacted in that space. And I think it's wonderful that we celebrate these things.
So I second everything that has been said, but I also want to sort of point to the idea of poetry as a kind of marketplace for ideas, for cultures, for languages, literature in general, but there's something about poetry in particular as a practice, as a form of literature that captures, I think, more than what the prosaic, and it goes beyond the prosaic, because I think it can capture nuances that go beyond just the cognitive, right? It can capture emotion, it can capture the audible, you can capture, in some senses, the sounds of languages, and the forms of music that are embedded in the forms of writing. I mentioned marketplace partly because, as a Singaporean, we're kind of a mercantile trading nation and so on, but there's a way in which the relationship between countries, certainly between, relatively smaller nations like Sweden and Singapore, and that are seafaring, trade is very important. That trade, that exchange, that sense of going out into the world and making friends and exchanging goods and services around the world is a core part of who we are, culturally, economically, certainly. And one of the things I think that is really good to see is that sort of economic relationship actually has a cultural side. Singapore is economically has a voice in the world, for better or worse. Culturally, we always feel like we don't, but in fact, maybe the two can go hand in hand. As we see with Theo's achievement, as we see with the fact that they actually are interested in some of the things I have to write them and publish it. But also, if we were talking about video games that are being made in Stockholm that are referencing Southeast Asia, we're working on some right now. There's a way in which this exchange, this relationship has a global implication. And I'm thinking also of the fact that there are quite a few in the room who have made those journeys. And from those journeys, interesting material has come out as well. So I think there are conversations that are already being had through poetry and elsewhere that maybe aren't necessarily picked up by the media, but they're certainly happening. It's quite encouraging.
And maybe just a quick observation about what we've all shared. I think we have all dwelled on the idea of the poetic voice as something that is spoken and heard. And I know most people in the room today are writers, publishers, etc., but there are also some who are not. And to you, a poem may be primarily an experience on the page. But I think for so many of us, the poem also leaves the page and goes into its spoken and heard forms. And that's a very powerful part of the experience as well. So the poem doesn't just live static on the page, as it were. And a personal story, since we're talking about first encounters and coming to all of this, I've told this story a few times. When I first arrived at university, I was very ashamed of my Singaporean accent. I was at university in the UK, and I sounded very different from everyone else around me. And they all had very different regional accents, of course, as well. And I found that because I found it so hard to hear my own voice and theirs, and their own voice and mine, I found it hard to write on the page as well. And what changed that for me was going along to open mics. And at poetry open mics, for those of us who have been in the audience at some point or had the privilege to share your poems in front of a crowd, it's a space that, because people are gathering around to hear the sound of the poetic voice in a very respectful and also quite accepting way, it's a space that makes room for all accents. It makes room for all, not just all accents, but then also all variations of the human experience, all backgrounds, all the different ways that we have grown up, right? So being able to go along to these open mics, being cajoled by my friends to read things that I've written before, that's what unlocked something and got me writing again. So I think for me, the page experience very closely tied to what we've just been talking about, which is that which is spoken, read, heard, and exchanged.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting experience that you're sharing, how you could get rid of that perhaps anxiousness or go to these open mics and share your stories. But one that also leads me to the question we're talking about, geographical and cultural aspect here. And from my understanding, you have been working and living in different cultures. And as poets, how do you perceive that because you come from a relatively cultural background, we all come from our own different specific context, but how is your poetry, like, I haven't had a chance to read your poems yet in Swedish, but of course when they translates into Swedish, then they transcend into another cultural context. Can you reason a little bit how this is perceived.
It's true. Well, so I think this is challenging ground because the poem, at the end of the day, is still a very personal experience. It's a very personal experience, and it voices something that is or should be true to you, even as it travels into the world and travels into the audience and is heard elsewhere. But this also means that in the space of the poem, there is only so far you can go in pretending to have an experience that you have not had. Right? And poems that try too hard to voice that, to claim someone else's voice, or they step into someone else's shoes, may fail on that account because the reader can tell that they are not the authentic voice of the poet. So it is challenging ground and in poetic practice, that's something that you have to navigate as well. Because you also don't want all of your writing to come from a very locked in and insular place that only you know and that is inaccessible to all others. What gives me some hope is the fact that when poems go out into the world, we can actually never fully step into the shoes of the reader. Right? We have no idea who's going to pick up the poem and read it, if at all. Most poems end up in a drawer and nobody reads that ever again, sometimes for the better. But we often send the poems out into the world like little ships and we have no idea where they will dock. And yet, they do. And yet people pick them up and find something in them to resonate with and to riff off and to build on in their own lives. And that gives me hope because even if we cannot fully inhabit the world of someone else, we can still say something that makes sense to their experience. We can still say something that lives in that little space between me and you, that everyone can sort of be part of.
If I may add on, I'm always moved and grateful for the other side of the equation, right? Which is you set work out into the world, but there is a curiosity and receptivity on the part of the reader. Imagine a reader in Sweden interested in the writing has actually read enough to think you're worth giving a prize, and so on and so forth. That sense of wanting to receive something that's from out there that could be extremely different and finding something worthwhile. And I'm always moved by that. I think it's critical to human relations, any kind of relations. I was just recalling the experience of translation since Ambassador lecture translation. I remember the struggles. It was really like being across a negotiating table, right? Because the languages are, even though English and Swedish, Northern European languages, but still they're different enough that there were things that cropped up. Like, I remember in one of the earlier translations, there was this line of mine that I thought was a very simple English language line. The correct answer to a mirror is always yes. And my Swedish translator said, "Do you mean a mirror or the mirror?" Because you can have to choose one in the Swedish language. And I was completely puzzled because it was a different worldview. And then, of course, there are the Singaporean words like tauke. We spent a few sleepless nights trying to figure out how to translate tauke in the most appropriate way. But the point is the process, I think. The point is wanting to reach across the table and come to an engagement and an agreement. I think that desire of both sides to sort of tussle and meet somewhere in the middle, it's what's really important. And in a sense, if you can work together well enough to translate poetry, you can work on anything else at all.
I mean, just going along with that, I don't got too much experience in translation, but I think there's something about the poetic genre that makes it essentially open. Because a poem, it doesn't really matter which tradition you're from, but it could appear graphometrically, visually very different on the page. It disrupts your expectations of what even a poem would sound like simply by reading it, and there's a freshness of encounter to it. And exactly as Alvin has pointed out, whenever you read a poem, or whenever you write a poem, it's a mutual sort of risk-taking.
Yeah.
I know we keep using marketplace metaphors here. I'm not sure why we keep doing this. But the other aspect of the marketplace that came to mind was that in any given marketplace, you hear a multitude of voices in different languages, in different versions of the same language. And I think on the page with a poem, there's a whole spectrum of languages you can hear in any single poem. It's part of its hospitality as well.
Theo, you are also, you mentioned that when we met before, that you are also translating from Chinese into English. And how is that process? Is it, do you recognize what
sure.
Alvin sharing?
Yeah. I don't translate very often, but I've had the privilege to work on poems by very different Chinese language writers. Mm-hmm. And the most recent poems that I've translated are actually poems written by a Chinese construction worker who's here in Singapore. Mm-hmm. And there are several layers to this, because I'm not just translating a poem from a different language. Mm-hmm. I'm translating a poem from a different experience of the world, a different experience of Singapore, a place that I know well, but also a different, a deeply different place in the world that I would never be able to penetrate completely. Different sources of rage, different sources of fear, different sources of yearning, and those challenges in some ways can be greater than the challenge of the language itself. But I think that's, and I'm glad Anne mentioned risk-taking earlier, because writing, translating, the making of meaning is always a risky enterprise. And the poem, within the space of the poem, you have to register some of that difference. You have to register that, yes, we all live in a world where hurt has taken place. We live in a world that is unequal. We live in a world that is broken. And yet, we live in a world where it is possible to gather around the space of the poem. So the poem has to register all of those things. It is not, it's not purely a diplomatic space, but neither is it purely a litany of bad things. The poem is to make space for both.
So in this work that you have been doing in terms of translations, that also provide opportunities for voices coming out that might not have been heard or previously. So is that the case in this particular work, you would say?
That's right. I think translation is definitely one way in which we can foreground the voices of others apart from us. And there are plenty of other ways to do so as well. And the literary community in the world that we're all here in gives us that space to do so. And that could look like many different things. That could look like, on my part, I'm a strong supporter of a community in Singapore known as the Migrant Writers of Singapore. It's a ground-up initiative, and migrant workers from different cultures have come together to make art and make words. And lots of the time, my role in this community is simply to stack chairs. It's to make sure that the lights are on. It's to put down my name and my IC number on an event booking because they would rather not put their FIN number down. And these are really simple things that I can do that don't involve, thankfully are not nowhere near as difficult as translation, that allow me to put their voices out there in a very small way. And I think that that's something that we all have the privilege to do in different ways. And we can all find ways in our own reading or writing or talking habits to do as well.
I think Theo raises a very important point here. Many of us are part of the literary community, is simply supporting other writers and giving other writers a chance to write. Even though sometimes there's a sort of slightly glorified aura around what it is to write a poem, but a poem could be something that can be spoken by anyone. Again, that hospitality, that making a space, that turning all of lights or stacking chairs, it's important.
Yeah, there is also the sense of craftsmanship, right? In a sense, being a writer is a lot like being a good carpenter or a barber. And I think it keeps us grounded to think of it in that way, you know, that you know, there's the lofty aspiration, but there's also the down-to-earth sense of working at something that can be difficult but worth getting right. And also the sense that it can be an act of service. And I think what Theo has been talking about is the sense in which it can be part of a broader spectrum of service that we render to others, especially those who may find it difficult to speak for or act for themselves. One of the things about Theo's work is, you know, having had the privilege of knowing him since he was a student, is that he's always had that social consciousness in him, right? I mean, his earliest work, even before working with the migrant workers, even before the translation and so on, he has been speaking into this space. And the fact that he went and pursued a master's degree in refugee studies, I believe, in Oxford. Who goes to Oxford to study refugee? Like, who actually does that, right? He does, okay, because he's a man of conscience. And his writing, what I'm trying to say is, I think his writing is a free practice, is part of the broader spirit and a broader sense of service that he's rendering in many different ways. Sorry to speak on your behalf. I just think it's something worth celebrating as part of this conversation. Yeah.
Right. Perhaps one final question before we end this panel. I think you started by saying that oral tradition is very important in many cultures. And in this day and age, when also our electronic devices taking over more and more, I see back home in Stockholm, I see here when I take the MRT almost every day that people are glued to their machines, devices. And then, of course, we're coming further away from the oral tradition where people actually remember to tell stories and to repeat stories. And to me, poetry is a little bit in that direction. It's about, reflecting, thinking, bringing up things from the past. Is this disappearing? Another big question, but where are we? Are the machines taking over? Or is there still space for poetry?
We might need a full hour for this.
Yeah.
I think what we are losing in the culture of reading is some of that receptivity that Alvin mentioned earlier. The willingness to open the page to a voice that comes from a very different place.
Yeah.
And what we do find on many social platforms is that we are fed voices that sound like ours, or opinions that feel like ours, or memes that we relate to, and that it's always nice, I think, to feel like you've found your tribe online.
Yeah.
But it's also equally important to be confronted by difference, and I think that's what we lose as a reading culture phase. And that's why we should celebrate the space of the poem, because it allows for that to happen actually with remarkably little prior preparation. If you step into an open mic, you don't need to have had a degree in literature. You certainly don't need to call yourself a writer. All you need to do is pull up a chair and allow yourself to be transformed by someone else's voice. And I think that's that simple acceptance of being able to put yourself in that space for an hour or two in evening, or the time it takes to read a book. That's something that we can all still access.
Yeah.
It doesn't, no fancy degrees required. So that's,
Very good point.
I mean, there's definitely something about the transience of the screen that demands new content over and over again. But since we mentioned the oral tradition, there's the role of memory as well, going back to the same stories over and over again, going back to treasured words over and over again. And I think we're missing a little bit of that, this idea of memory, this idea of coming back to the same words, but maybe as a changed person. coming to different words and allowing them to change us in that encounter, in that space of tussle. Well, there's something that maybe the screen and swiping right and left doesn't quite enable, and I think poetry is a precious space for that. The way we have to read a poem and it's not obvious immediately to us what it means. It's not transparent. You have to work your way through it. There's a craftedness, but there's also a carefulness and a dedication of reading. That's very precious in this space, and it's unfortunately it's a very different mode of reading from what we see online. Was it kind just one?
Yeah, I do take heart from the fact that artificial intelligence today still cannot write an Arthur Young poem worth of that, right? But that in a sense it still falls short on writing a proper poem. And if one day, even if the technology manages to write a poem in my voice, no one will invest the training needed for the machine to learn that. It still cannot write from my experience. So that very personal, that very subjective, individual experience will still be something that requires, I think, human intervention to bring forward. As long as we value it ourselves as human beings. I mean, that really is the challenge. Do we, as you say, do we actually value that difference? Do we value our individual voices? Do we want to hear from people like us? If we do not, it's not the machines who are going to get us. But if we do, the machines can in fact help us. I mean, I think about how YouTube and TikTok and technologies are actually helping to convey these voices across the world. During the pandemic, right? We were doing readings. I remember there was a reading hosted by, there was this little group run by a Japanese poet who had met us all at one festival in India somewhere along the way. Out of that one experience during the pandemic, she felt the need to reach out because of that isolation we all felt. She decided to start a reading series, just bringing that small circle back together just to hear each other's voices and reconnect. And that reading, long after the lockdowns are gone, that reading is still running every month. I don't attend that often, but once in a while, I join in, and I'm reminded that there is just no replacement for that human warmth. And poetry is a conduit for that warmth, and it transcends space and time. You can be read 300 years from now, and someone gives you a sense of that.
Poetry and zoo.
Poetry and zoo. Yeah, right. So I think the challenge is not machines. The challenge is us, our attitudes, our mindset, our priorities.
Good. Just for a second, everything that you said.
Final word from you,
I just wanted to say thank you to you, Ambassador, for hosting this conversation, but also to Alvin and Anne. Thank you for being such inspiration in your own work. And thank you for joining us for this lovely.
Thank you for your hospitality and receptivity.
It's great having you and bring a lot of inspirational energy into this evening. So I think we should all thank our panel with a round of applause.
The truth is that every word and image is a gift to be shared and sharpened between friends, and I'm so glad that there are so many of you friends here this evening. And so to describe a writer as operating alone is to imagine a fisherman with no crew to steer and captain the ship, no family waiting at the jetty, and no port to return to. To my parents, teachers, friends, publishers, readers, colleagues, and of course my wife, you are the anchor and the sail. The catch may be meager, but it belongs to all of you. So thank you. And my deepest appreciation also to the Swedish Institute. It's always humbling to have someone see the best in your work and ignore all the many flaws. So that's nice. And thanks very much to Alvin and Anne for being part of this evening's panel. And finally, of course, thanks to Ambassador Anders, as well as everyone at the Swedish Embassy for welcoming here this evening. Such a lovely place. Thank you. So the Embassy has kindly asked me to read a few poems, and no poet gives up the opportunity to pontificate. So I considered reading some of the poems that were mentioned in the Swedish Institute's very generous citation, especially Strangers Drowning, which is a poem I wrote some years ago about Singapore's response to the Vietnamese refugee crisis of the 1970s. But I've decided to go with 3 newer pieces instead. The first poem returns to some of the questions that have been central to my work since my first book, They Speak Only Our Mother Tongue, in 2011. Who is welcome in our communities and who is not? Who gets to decide if the door stays open or closed? Now, growing up, I spent a lot of time in my grandparents' flats along Ganges Avenue, where on the 9th of August every year, you can still see the Chinooks hung with the national flag making their way towards the Padang. Now, the door of their flat was always open. The radio was permanently on, and my granddad watching from the window as the neighbors came and went. So perhaps it's no surprise that this was the image that I came back to when I tried to imagine a city that was more willing to leave its doors ajar. This poem is for them. It's called The View. Somewhere, a flag is torn from its plastic. A child ties the strings to the window grille, and a blood shadow falls across the room. There is red over everything. The chairs, which were always beige, and also the floor, which is marble and washes easily. And even on television, the men seem to redden as they troop into sight. Nothing escapes. Close your eyes and the darkness takes on a pinkish hue, which gathers from the sides like a flood. It's hard to see now with all of this red, especially if you were one to celebrate the view before, and harder to imagine how the room could have been with its softer colors meant to set off the coastal light. I think of it sometimes, the low carved table, the worn coffee mugs, and beyond our open doorway, the corridor. Now the second poem, which is also the most recent poem that I'll share this evening, strikes a more personal note. As some of you know, I received the news of this prize while on my honeymoon. And 2 days after we got home, my wife Sherry and I moved into the flat where we now live. So the thing about this flat is that it's also where I spent my teenage years growing up. And moving back into an old home is a funny business. If you encounter any ghosts, they are just as likely to be the ghosts of your own younger self. My last book, Moving House, took its title from one of the poems inside, which coincidentally is about moving out of that house. So it was only right that I wrote a new poem about moving back in. And this poem is called Moving In. It's about coming to terms with some of your very own ghosts. Moving in. Through the door before I knew it, a sort of frequency guides the feet across the tiles, the shedding of shoes, the parquet stairs tensing in small arcs beneath the newspaper. A memory of workmen ascending and descending with their charts in hand, the slow assembly of shelves, parts to call a life, our life. Here in the house which has been made new, a day's weight slung unevenly across my shoulders, I move surely past the dining chairs, the easel, past the landing and the elbow of the banister, and feel the cool spreading from where wood makes way for vinyl. My hand missing the switch in the wall before suddenly an edge of mold fills the nostrils. In that fog are the shapes of boxes haphazardly arrayed, the barest outline of a room that once was mine and is now spare. What visits unsparing on the present is not the past, but some appendix of it. This self that was, that like Hamlet's ghost, still haunts the ramparts, lingers while tending to freshly watered plants to take in a familiar view. My fingers find the lights, away with ghosts, and in the bright contours of your furniture and mine, sprightly and plastic, the yet unwrapped pictures still waiting their turn, all other lives recede, all other houses which are this house, a neighborhood of streets laid over and over, belonging now not to the days, but the night's commonwealths. Let me take a drink. And now, finally, a longer poem. I learned when I started reading poems in front of an audience that you should always warn them when it's going to be a longer poem. Those who need to can go to the bathroom, etc., etc. Yeah. So this will be a longer poem, but it will also be my last poem. Anyone who has spent any amount of time in Singapore, and Ambassador, that since last October for you, would know that one of the defining experiences of life in the tropics is that of having flying ants fill your house when it's about to rain, especially in the last months of the year. And I have so many vivid memories of these flying ants, like Dad and I putting out bowls of water to trick them into flying towards the reflection of the light, or keeping myself awake on guard duty during national service by watching the ants struggle in mortal combat with the lizards that make their home in my guard post. And with these ants, it's a funny thing because conventional wisdom tells us that worker ants, those that crawl along the ground, are the industrious ones, right? Keeping their noses to the ground, building cities that are much larger than themselves. And what fewer people know is that the flying ants, although they seem much flightier, much less dependable, like poets, are no different. When a colony is under threat, the worker ants send out their young as winged representatives to build new homes and new lives elsewhere, so that something of the old colony will survive in a new place. So this last poem brings together all of these different threads that we've been talking about tonight. It's a tale of lizards and ants, or as I've called it, a parable of feet and wings. And just before I read it, I want to say thank you all for coming and for listening to me this evening. Parable of feet and wings. They are at it again, the pair of them, scuttle and cackle and scuttle and hiss. Spooky because it's coming through the rolled up poster that are stashed behind my desk. All month long, the nights flush with hot rain. First thing you see in the morning, the room's four corners slick with wings, bones from a feast. From somewhere down the labyrinth that's under my bed, a guilty laugh. Or not. Nature's appetite, says Dad, as he sweeps the glistening film from off the floor. Each perfect teardrop of a wing snapped at the stem, a parachute made to land the body somewhere safe, or catch a drift of tropical air above a reading lamp. Well, here, you'd best get used to it. The cloud of ants, the gecko's joy, a small carnage. That's all there is to it. I think of a time when, clad unwillingly in green, I stood sentry for a night in a whitewashed post, watching the shut gates of my camp. Just keeping awake, barely, the sharp knob of a rifle scope slung against my ribs. Across the hard grey square of the floor, with their heads bitten clean off, were the carcasses of ants, often with their feet and wings intact. The culprits? Well, they made a whole show of it, now slouching in wait beneath the light's bare electric coil, now tussling in full view over a spent creature's parts. Not for any lack, but seemingly just the fun of it. When the sky softened into morning, the others found me still transfixed by the sight of the night's last travelers, falling, exhausted, and then hauled away. But harmless, really. And sometimes even a picture of good. The way they build whole civilizations out of the soil. Industrious. Not without grounds, our own distrust builds against their flightier cousins who shimmer about our lights. In the dimming years of the empire, some would later say the chandeliers of the Raffles ballroom had never burned so bright. Look how they burn. In the days that followed, we learned nothing lasts in these parts except what takes to the earth unseen, gnaws through the mud until the foundations hold. But I digress. It is the heat that draws both the geckos and their prey, long-limbed and free, the ones still dancing when the lights go out. So, imagine my surprise when I found out that these winged apparitions were not a different breed. When the storms come, a colony has two choices: lose the walls and chambers of your mud-slicked nest to wet decay, or send your best sojourners out like doves from an ark, that elsewhere some hardy offshoot of your own might burrow and thrive. A mystery, but only to our earthbound eyes, that love by any other name is flight. So now look how much more vicious in this light appears the gecko's appetite. Stoop close and see how fraught and unburdened by metaphor, how free, each whip of the tail, each graceful taking to the air, which ones, each season, leave the earth behind, and yet are there. Thank you.